When we started defining transactions, we said that two attributes representing the same concept have to have the same name. There are situations, though, where we'll have to use different names for two attributes that are basically the same thing. It will be because of situations like that that we will start looking at subtypes. Let's take a look at this case. Within our application, we are dealing with cities, countries, and tourist attractions. Now we want to start working with flights. When we define a flight, it will not only have an identifier, but also the city and country it is leaving from, and the city and country where it is arriving. We will be using subtypes when conceptually identical attributes need to fulfill different roles. Let's take a look at this case. Over here we have our country transaction that we just implemented it, with country ID, country name, and the second level corresponding to cities. And now we also have the flight transaction, with its identifier and its flight description. And we will need to set an origin country and city and a destination country and city for this flight. But here we run into a problem. We have attributes with the same names, and that is not possible. So what's our solution to this? First of all, we'll have to define attributes with different names. So for the country and city of origin, instead of country ID and country name, as we see over here, we'll change their names and we'll call the identifier for the country of origin, flight departure country ID. And for the name, we'll use flight departure country name. And for the departure city, we'll use flight departure city ID and flight departure city name. And for the destination country and city, we'll rename them flight arrival country ID, flight arrival country name, flight arrival city ID, and flight arrival city name. And what will we do now? Well, we'll define flight departure country ID as a subtype of country ID. Flight departure country name is a subtype of country name. Flight departure city ID is a subtype of city ID. And flight departure city name is a subtype of city name. And we'll do the same thing with the set of attributes that correspond to the destination country and city. So flight departure country ID and flight departure city ID will make up a foreign key from the country city table in this flight transaction. And the same thing will happen with flight arrival country ID and flight arrival city ID. They will also make up a foreign key from the country city table in this flight transaction. As a result, GeneXus will automatically carry out all referential integrity constraints. Let's return to RKB and we'll define the flight transaction. A new object of transaction type called flight. We define the flight ID, the flight description, and we'll start to define the subtype groups for the origin country and city and the destination country and city for this flight. They will be flight departure country ID, flight departure country name, flight departure city ID, flight departure city name. And now we'll define flight arrival country ID, flight arrival country name, and also the city information, flight arrival city ID, and flight arrival city name. We save the changes, and so now we'll define two groups of subtypes. One group will be called departure, and it will have the flight departure country ID and country name, and flight departure city ID and city name, and these will be subtypes of country ID, country name, city ID, and city name. And then we'll also define another group of subtypes that will be called arrival, where we'll do the same thing, but for the flight arrival, country ID, country name, city ID, and city name attributes. So we select New Object and choose Subtype Group and call it Departure. And we'll start defining the subtype group. We'll define Flight Departure Country ID as a subtype of Country ID, then we define Flight Departure Country Name as a subtype of Country Name. Flight Departure City ID will be a subtype of City ID, and Flight Departure City Name will be a subtype of City Name. We save the changes, and we'll also define the second group of subtypes, which we'll call Arrival. And now I'll have Flight Arrival Country ID as a subtype of Country ID, Flight Arrival Country Name, which is a subtype of Country Name, Flight Arrival City ID as a subtype of City ID, and Flight Departure City Name, or Flight Arrival City Name as a subtype of City Name. We save this as well, and if we take a look at our flight transaction, we can see the icon in front of those attributes that were defined as subtypes. We'll modify the data type of the flight description attribute and set it to character 35. We'll also add the airline data to this flight transaction. So we'll create the airline ID and airline name. These airline ID and airline name attributes represent concepts which should exist beyond the scope of the flight. So we're going to define an airline transaction. So I'll go to New Object, choose a transaction, name it Airline, and I add airline ID and airline name. We save our changes and have our airline transaction. Let's return to our flight transaction. Note that if we want to make sure that a flight doesn't have the same departure and arrival city, we can declare an error rule to manage that situation. So So here we establish that the departure and arrival cities have to be different. So I type the error rule. And what will our condition be? It will be if the flight arrival city ID is equal to the flight departure city ID. So we save, and in order to finish this transactions design, we'll add an attribute that will handle the departure time. I'll call it flight departure time. And it will be a date time. And we'll also add a new attribute which will contain the flight's maximum capacity. So I add that, and I'll call it flight total capacity. And it'll be a numeric 4. We save the changes. And so now we've looked at both the concept and implementation of subtypes.